Hi, I'm Eddie Robinson with Houston Public Media, and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Now, over the next hour, we'll have an opportunity to speak with Dr. Gates about his brand new documentary, The Black Church. This is our story, this is our song. We'll also give you an opportunity to take a brief look at this powerful program. But first, today's presentation is made possible by the University of Houston Racial Equity and Social Justice Committee in partnership with PBS and Houston Public Media. Let me introduce the co-chairs of the committee, Dr. Robert McPherson and Dr. Elwyn Lee.
Hello and welcome to the University of Houston, home of Houston Public Media. I'm Elwyn Lee, Vice President for Neighborhood and Strategic Initiatives.
And I'm Bob McPherson, Dean of the College of Education. Together, we serve as co-chairs of the university's Racial Equality and Social Justice Committee. We are so proud to bring you this conversation today with celebrated Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., as we learn about his powerful series on the Black Church and its role in African American faith, music, culture, and social justice. I want to also offer special thanks to PBS CEO Paula Kerger for broadcasting this outstanding series that you can watch on Houston Public Media TVA.
An important part of our mission at the University of Houston is to draw strength from our diversity, to transform lives and communities, and to serve as an engine for discovery, conversation, and change. To that end, the events of 2020 compelled us to take a bold stand against hate, racism, and discrimination, and to join the charge to help dismantle them. Last year, President Renu Khator empowered the formation of the UH Racial Equity and Social Justice Committee to facilitate meaningful dialogue and generate actionable ideas to bring about change.
And we know that celebrating Black culture and uplifting Black voices, as we will do today, is one of the many keys to achieving this goal. So I hope you enjoyed today's program and that you leave inspired by the history, culture, and front line of hope that is the Black Church.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson and Dr. Lee. Now, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. is a well-known historian, author, educator, and filmmaker, having been responsible for such series as The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, Africa's Great Civilizations, and of course, Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates, Jr. And that's just the public Dr. Gates that we're all familiar with. But someone who actually knows the private real man is U.S. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Recently I had an opportunity to speak with Representative Lee about the Black Church and her friend, Skip Gates.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, it's a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today from your office in Washington.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Congresswoman, explain to us your connection with the renowned historian, professor, filmmaker, Dr. Henry Louis Gates. How did that connection come about?
Well, the best kind of friend is a classmate. And this distinguished scholar, this renowned international historian, is just my friend. It's just my classmate. We both were at Yale University at the same time. We were both products of the movement, the commitment during that time of civil rights and the opportunities for African Americans, Negroes, Coloreds, Black Americans to integrate various white institutions that had been white since their very birth. And not only had been white, but had excluded, had prohibited African Americans from coming to that particular institution. And frankly, we were also students during the Black student movement and had a great sense of duty and passion for what we were there for and what we needed to accomplish. So I can assure you that besides having fun as students, we were very serious about our mission. And Skip Gates, as he was known to us, had a lot of fun as a student, but it was very serious times. And we were engaged in a lot of serious discussion and dialogue about saving the world.
What do you think it is about Dr. Gates that resonates with so many people, so many different people throughout the years? What makes him so captivating to so many?
Well, he has a great sense of curiosity and the ability to make people feel comfortable wherever they are. He's always got a sense of fun in his voice, but you know that he is a very serious scholar. Like, I view him as my classmate, a lot of fun when I see him, but every time I do see him, he's engaged in serious work of communicating the depth of our history. A great part of our educational moments in Yale was engaged in a shutdown of the university. It was during the Bobby Seale trial. It was during the time when National Guards took over the streets of New Haven. And we were committed to being effective advocates for justice and the recognition of African-American history. And so we had a lot of work to do. We had a lot of work with the Black Students Association at Yale. And Skip, however, carried that sense of mission and history. And through the time of his status of being renowned, he makes people feel comfortable. He's a great storyteller. He likes to hear your stories, and he captures the essence of our history and who we are as a people. People love to hear that. And then I think he gets you to talk about your family in a way that you've never thought of. And that, I think, has been one of his most endearing elements, to get people to talk about that family.
And we get a sense of that family, that essence of family, in the Black Church, the documentary, the project that he's working on. When you personally think of the Black Church and the role it's played in our community, what are some things, Congresswoman, that immediately comes to mind when you think of the Black Church?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted. I am delighted the Black Church is getting the attention long overdue, long to be recognized, but not asking to be recognized. And it takes Dr. Skip Gates to get it done, because the Black Church was a cornerstone of the beginnings of real movement in the Black community, but it was even the cornerstone of our life as slaves, and in essence, after emancipation. And we all know that there were two emancipations, 1863 and 1865. All throughout history, the Black Church has been the place of the educated, the place of the uneducated, the place of revolutionaries, the place of those who wanted to be peacemakers, the place of solutions, the place of problems, the place where you could go, and the place for easing and soothing your soul. It was a place where, after you came from discovering that another Black person had been killed by the Klan, another brutal murder had taken place, another taking of the life of a 14-year-old, in the essence of Emmett Till, the church was where we buried him. The church was where we came in the midst of the bombing of the 4 girls in Birmingham. And so I think what is important about what is happening is that the story of the church is now to be told, but the recognition, because the church always puts itself as the healer of your soul, and therefore does not promote itself to the extent that it wants to be seen, or it can even be seen, because you get this separation of church and state. And so it's a difficult place to be able to push your church forward, or even your religion forward, because it's supposed to be the value of America, the democracy that we have, that allows people to practice their faith, and it doesn't interfere in their status in secular life or in the government's eye. They're not diminished because they have a certain faith. That's not the way it's supposed to be. I fight for that every day as a member of the Judiciary Committee. And so the church does not necessarily get its rightful place, because it is not to be mixed with government or to be mixed with society in a pompous or self-promotion way. I am glad that the Black Church, the story is going to be told of how meaningful it is to all of us.
Yes, and Congresswoman, you mentioned the healing of the soul, and I love that. And to me, that represents gospel music. And I understand that you're a fan of gospel music as well. Is that a fair statement to make?
It is more than a fair statement. I am a lover of gospel music, and I love the new, the old, and the in-between. I love the spirituals of yesteryear with and the music that was sung on the slave plantations with no music, or the gospel music that was sung. It was music, but it had none of the instruments that we would expect today. And yes, and I think gospel music tells the story of our lives. It is healing. It is soothing. It is soft. It is loud. It is in between. It's for young people. It's for it's for children. It is certainly for our elders. It is for our wise ones. It is for an international audience. If you sit and listen to gospel music, and I am a promoter of gospel music.
And speaking of which, I'm wondering, when you're sitting out there in DC and someone's on the floor and they're getting on your last nerve, and you just want to sit in your seat and just start rocking as if it were a rocking chair. Do you ever find yourself, even in committee meetings, is there a song that comes to mind that just makes you want to just start humming, Congresswoman?
Well, I take some of these old songs and I take some of the new songs as well. And just to be truthful, I introduced the first gospel music resolution in the United States Congress. It was a bipartisan initiative, and we have done so now for more than a decade. But I love the music that tells stories. And so I love Amazing Grace. I love Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And what you need when you're rocking and looking at what else can happen, you need to sing that song that is sung so beautifully by my neighbor, my friend, my sister, my fellow Houstonian, Yolanda Adams. The battle is not mine, it is the Lord. I tell you, that can get you through a lot of times in your life, and particularly a lot of times of what we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Well said. And I was just getting ready to say the exact same thing. We certainly need it. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
So grateful to be with you this evening. Thank you. And as well, thank you, Skip, my classmate, for telling that wonderful story about Black churches.
Again, a big thanks to Representative Lee for taking the time to speak with us. Now, the Black Church. This is our story. This is our song. It's a moving 2-part, 4-hour documentary, executive produced, hosted, and written by Dr. Gates, that explores the 400-year-old story of the Black church in America, the changing nature of worship spaces, and the men and women who inspired and molded a community from the pulpit, the choir loft, and the church pews. Here now is a brief look at the Black church.
This is our story. Oh, this is our song. Praising my Savior. Oh, all the day long. All the day long. All the day long.
Ah, that is great.
In the name of Jesus today, oh God, we are rising.
The Black church was more than just a spiritual home. It was the epic center of Black life. Out of it came our Black businesses, our Black educational institutions.
The Black church gave people a sense of value, belonging, and worthiness. I don't know how we could have survived as a people without it.
To tell the story of American religion is to tell a political story.
The Black church helped us to withstand all the slings and arrows of segregation and the segregationists.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
Freedom!
Who are the 5 great Black preachers of all time?
There's so many.
Prathia Hall.
Renita Weems.
We serve a Jesus who came and turned over the tables.
Jeremiah Wright.
Gardner Taylor.
Gardner Taylor.
Howard Thurman.
I left our oldest Moss.
Presiding Bishop Michael Curry.
Love can be sacrificial.
Did you think that you were going to get one amen out of those Brits?
I learned how to see amens in their eyes.
I'ma clap my hands. I'ma sing to the Lord.
Some might argue that the Black church is the first Black theater.
The role of music in the Black church is everything.
How do you define gospel music?
Oh, really simple. Gospel music is the sonic presentation that talks about the majesty of Jesus.
Entertainment shouldn't be in the church. What do you think the preacher does?
Yeah,
the preacher, and there, and if and what? That's entertainment. The African American church is 80 to 90% women, but the leadership is 80 to 90% male.
There's an awful price to pay when you say that you're a same-gender loving person.
If you say you were born this way, then you're saying, God, you're a liar.
We are a testament to the goodness and the grace of God. Everything in the world has tried to kill us, and we're still here.
Culture says you the wrong race. The price says I made your race, and I ain't made no mistake.
It was our balm in Gilead, the place where our people made a way out of no way. It was that place from which our souls could look back and wonder how we got over. We call it the church.
Dr. Gates, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
I wouldn't have missed it. I'm sorry about all that bad weather you guys had. We had to reschedule, but I hope everyone's doing okay now.
We're making it. We're surviving, but we're so grateful that you took the time out of your schedule to be able to come with us here today. Thank you.
Well, I love Houston. And my friend Paula Kerger asked me personally if I would do this, and I can't ever say no to her.
Well, look, Professor Gates, we're going to jump right in. This documentary, The Black Church, seemed like a massive undertaking. I mean, you were speaking with so many pastors, so many historians, including renowned gospel artists, various church officials across the country. Dr. Gates, why tackle this subject matter to begin with, and how long did it take you to complete?
Well, I hope it was obvious. One of my friends wrote, "It seemed like you were having fun." And oh man, was I having fun. Being able to interview John Legend and Jennifer Hudson, Yolanda Adams, T.D. Jakes, Otis Moss III in Cleveland, Bishop Blake in L.A., Bishop Yvette Flunder in Oakland, the first woman to be named a bishop of the AME Church between 1816 and the year 2000, Bishop Vashti McKenzie, Bishop Michael Curry, who did the royal wedding and who tried to get an amen as hard as he could in Westminster Abbey and was unsuccessful. I loved it. It took us about 3 years. People ask me, well, why did you do it? Well, let me say this. Yeah. One of the reasons, this is our most popular show ever. And I got some amazing news last night. My book, the companion book, The Black Church, this is our story, this is our song, just debuted on the New York Times bestseller list at number 13.
Wonderful
Thank
news.
You, Jesus.
Wonderful news.
I'm really happy about that. But when we started, we could have no idea that our country had suffered from the twin pandemics of an invisible virus that had been attacking the planet. 500,000 people dead, 750,000 people died in the Civil War, the whole Civil War, and we've already surpassed 500,000. That's horrible tragedy. People who celebrated Christmas or Hanukkah and the New Year, and a year later they're dead. That's horrible. And so at a time when our country needed to hear stories of struggle and redemption, faith and hope against the greatest odds, there was our series. It was an act of God, people would say. But we worked on it about 3 years. And I always have a method when it drives my producers crazy. I make them write to maybe 50 people in a particular field, scholars or ministers, academics, lay people, and say, here's how a documentary works. In 1 hour, you tell 12 stories, basically, 5 minutes piece. So we have 4 hours. So what are your 50 stories, if you're telling the history of the Black church, which are indispensable? And we get 500 possibilities back.
Wow. And
then we have to decide what we can film, because it's very hard to film Richard Allen founding the AME Church in 1816. There's not a lot of footage for that.
Right.
And then obviously the list is top heavy on contemporary events. We need a balance. And then we segment those 500 stories into categories and themes, and then we reduce them. And then we argue and we fight. The biggest argument that we fought was between the series producer Stacey Holman and me over the title. Now, obviously, it was going to be called The Black Church. But what was the subtitle? Stacey wanted to call it How I Got Over, which is one of the amazing classic Black gospel songs.
That's right.
And I wanted to use a line from Blessed Assurance, which is almost the anthem of the Black Church. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. And then the refrain is, this is our story.
There you go.
This is our song.
That's right.
But this is my story. This is my song. And I wanted to change it to, this is our story. This is our song. So we fought, and she sent me playlists, and I sent her back playlists. And finally, I said, okay, we need an arbiter. We need a judge. And let me see if I can think of somebody who knows marketing. How about Oprah Winfrey?
You think?
And I sent my friend Oprah an email.
Okay.
And I didn't hear from her. The next day, I came down here to my kitchen where I am right now, my house in Harvard Square. And I was grinding my Ethiopian coffee beans as I do every day. And I turned my cell phone on, and there was a voicemail message. And I listened to it, and it was a woman's voice saying, this is our story, this is our song. And it was Oprah. And I called Stacey, said, the state rests.
That's the title. That's great.
It.
That's a wonderful story. And it was perfect medicine. It couldn't have come at the perfect time, Dr. Gates. I mean, it was such a compelling and a powerful documentary on so many levels. You know, what were the primary takeaways that you really wanted to ensure that the audience would keep in mind after viewing? I mean, some audiences may not even have known about the influence and the power of the Black church. What were some of those takeaways?
Well, there are a couple things. One is that the Black church was always political from the very beginning and remains political to this day. You know, Karl Marx dismissed all of organized religion famously as an opiate of the people, meaning that it kept them from being concerned with politics. Mm-hmm. And that, you can argue with that, but that was never true of the Black church, because it was born in political protest against anti-Black racism. The first Black denomination was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. And it all got started when Absalom Jones and his friend Richard Allen were worshiping in St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And Absalom Jones sat down in the 1790s, and he was praying and in the white pew, and somebody came and told him to get up and get to the back. And he said, later for you. And they both left, all the Black people left, and they formed their own church in 1792, 1793. Mm-hmm. And then by 1816, they had formed, Richard Allen had formed his own denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And Frederick Douglass taught Sunday school, gave sermons at the AME Zion Church in New Bedford, Massachusetts, after he escaped from enslavement in Maryland. Henry Highland Garnett, another Black abolitionist, was a Presbyterian minister. Cut to Reconstruction. 3 of the 16 Black men elected to Congress during Reconstruction were ministers. You know the phrase 40 acres and a mule, which we're hearing frequently. That's right. When people debate reparations. And I fully support H.R. 40, introduced into the House by my Yale classmate and dear friend, Sheila Jackson Lee. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. 40 acres and a mule was coined by General William Tecumseh Sherman in Savannah after the successful March to the Sea, 2 days after he had a meeting with 20 Black ministers. Wow. In Savannah, headed by the mighty Garrison Fraser, who had been born a slave and bought his own freedom and that of his wife. Sure. And Sherman, they had a stenographer there, and the whole transcript appeared in the newspaper the next day. And they say, Sherman said, well, what do you people want? And Garrison Fraser said, we want land and to be left alone. We want land so that we can prosper, so that we can accrue wealth. And that's where the concept of redistributing the land of former Confederates came from and became the popular phrase 40 acres and a mule. In Reconstruction, there were 2,000 black men appointed or elected to office. 243 were ministers. In the 1930s and 40s, the face of the civil rights movement was Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a Baptist minister, the head of Abyssinian Baptist Church, just like his father was. And the whole civil rights movement unfolded in the church, around the church, with the lyrics of gospel music and the sorrow songs, the songs invented by our formerly enslaved ancestors, ringing in their ears and floating out of the mouths. The more afraid people were, the more they sang. And Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, of course, were deeply seeped in the church. And Martin Luther King gave what Bishop Yvette Flender called the greatest sermon in history. I've been to the mountaintop at the temple of the Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. And now we, 2 years ago, 1,000 black ministers signed a statement endorsing Black Lives Matter. And many, many ministers, including my friend Bishop T.D. Jakes in Dallas, and Yvette Flender in Oakland, and Otis Moss III in Chicago. And all across the country, they have social justice missions. Tracy Blackman famously said, Ferguson is the church. So I don't think that we have ever been able to escape concern with politics, as some other denominations have. In other words, I'm trying to say that from the very beginning, our ministers prepared our ancestors for life after death, for heaven, but for a life here on earth after the death of slavery, after the death of Jim Crow, after the death of the ugly face of white supremacy. It was a place where a person with the lowliest social status in the larger American society could get dressed in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, show up in the confines of that church, no matter how small it was, and be a king or a queen, be a saint, have dignity, wear white gloves, pass the collection plate, read the membership list of who was there, and serve in 1,001 other ways. W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest black intellectual of all time, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, wrote a beautiful passage. He said, any proscribed people must have a social center. They basically replicate in microcosm the world outside the color line from which they're excluded. And then Du Bois said, for this people, that social center is the Black church. And that was in 1903, and it remains the case today.
It's such a remarkable documentary. It really provides a huge emphasis on understanding the role of the Black church within our community. And, you know, to be honest with you, you know, I grew up in church myself, and in the backwoods of Fernwood, Mississippi, at Oak Grove Missionary Baptist Church. And it was a very powerful moment for me because it really inspired me. And fast forward, you know, I came out to my parents, you know, in 2007, and what was really phenomenal was the fact that the Black church really addressed the LGBTQ community, and I was so grateful that you all involved that community within this documentary. And Dr. Gates, I wanted to ask you this, of all the churches and of all the denominations you met and spoke with for this documentary, Professor Gates, did you ever get the gist that any megachurch pastor or those renowned leaders of religious Black institutions would ever endorse same-sex marriage ceremonies?
You could characterize this as a love letter to our ancestors and this sacred institution that they created. But as you know, in any family, any loving relationship, part of love is criticism. And so we critique the church's homophobia. We critique the church's sexism. With the AME Church, there wasn't a woman named Bishop until the year 2000. What kind of sense is that? When Jarena Lee went to Richard Allen in 1819 and said she'd been called by God to preach, he said, well, I didn't get that call, you know?
Yeah.
So you know what she did? It was some boring brother who was preaching. And she said, I had enough of this. She stood up in her pew and interrupted and just preached, tore the house down.
Wonderful.
And after the sermon, Bishop Allen said, well, I guess maybe I just got the call. And Jarena Lee in 1833 preached 138 sermons. In 1835, 692 sermons. But the AME Church didn't ordain her until 2016, 16 years after Vashti McKenzie became the first female bishop. And I had friends who died in, makes me sad to think about it, the first wave of HIV/AIDS before the cocktail of drugs had been fabricated. And some of them were very religious, and the church turned their back on them.
Sure.
One denomination said, abstinence is a cure. I mean, give me a break. So the church has this blind spots. One of the people, Yolanda Pierce, the dean of the Howard School of Divinity, says the church is 80 to 90% female, and its leadership is 80 to 90% male. So I didn't specifically ask that question to the ministers, but I can't imagine, but they're all on record about same-sex marriage. And I can't imagine that anyone today who's a civilized, sensible person could possibly be against same-sex marriage. It's, I think, would be irreligious to do so. God is love. Love has many faces.
Yeah.
Just like God has many faces and many names, so does love. I couldn't belong to a church that didn't sanction and embrace same-sex marriage. Now, I did interview Bishop Yvette Flunder.
That's right.
Who came out, and when she did, her church kicked her out. One of the sub-themes is the history of the black churches. Various people being kicked out for one reason or another. Thomas A. Dorsey, when he introduced blues riffs into sacred music, they said, sorry, you got to go. Sister Rosetta Tharpe played electric guitar in nightclubs. They go, sorry. When the Edwin Hawkins Singers sang Oh Happy Day in 1968, their church kicked them out. So you know what they did?
What's that?
They made their own church. They formed their own church, which is what Yvette Flunder did.
That's right.
She created the City of Refuge in Oakland, California, and it's a subdivision, or it's under the rubric of the United Church of Christ. So the church has its thing, it has its sins to ask absolution of, ask forgiveness for, and homophobia is one of them. One of my proudest achievements is the epilogue of the companion book, The Black Church. It's called On the Beautiful and the Sublime, the Frenzy and the Trance. Those last two terms come from W.E.B. Du Bois, on the Holy Ghost. And I talk about how spirit possession and speaking in tongues were noted in Africa. Our enslaved ancestors, forced in chains on those ships, brought those forms of worship with them. And we see them manifested in black churches from the 17th, 18th, throughout the 19th century. And you can see them today. I asked John Legend, did you get the Holy Ghost? He goes, oh yeah. Just hit me, roll me across the floor, up against the wall. Did you speak in tongues? He said, absolutely. And that's very interesting to me, those cultural continuities.
That's right.
And if you look at Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Vodun in Haiti, Hoodoo in New Orleans, they have similar possession rituals, which clearly came from the African continent.
Dr. Gates, you know, I wanted to connect with a friend of yours. You mentioned her earlier in the show. You know her, a woman by the name of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And I understand you, Representative Lee, and her husband are really good friends, and you all go way back, right?
And we met in September 1969. I hadn't even turned 19 yet. I would later in September. Sheila Jackson, and we met at a party. You know, I think the first weekend we were all at Yale. September '69 was when Yale let in women. Sheila transferred.
Okay.
And I transferred in as a sophomore, and we became fast friends right away. And I followed Sheila's career from the time she graduated, and I'm very proud of her. I love her, and I want her to let us do her family tree and analyze her DNA for finding your roots. And I think that I persuaded her finally to do it. Her husband, Elwin Lee, went to law school, as Sheila did, and is a professor of law right there in Houston. And they're very good friends. Their son was my student.
Wow.
At Harvard. Now you can't beat that for continuity and the generations. I think of him as a nephew.
You know, Dr. Gates, your documentary, Many Rivers to Cross, was just so powerful to me. You know, it even encouraged me to go online and grab a ticket to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. But another groundbreaking series that you were responsible for was Finding Your Roots, which helps educate millions of Americans about the histories and the cultures of our nation and our world. Tell us some highlights from that series, if you will, Dr. Gates.
Well, the fundamental premise of Finding Your Roots is that all of our ancestors, once they've transitioned, are in a kind of genealogical purgatory. And they're waiting for us to find them. And when we find them, we open the vaults where they have been suspended, and we let them tell us their name and their stories. And it turns out that those stories have influenced you invisibly, by osmosis, in ways that you had no idea about. So that, you know, you've heard families say, well, that's how the Colemans do it. That was my mother's family.
Right.
Well, that's a Gates tradition. And it turns out that they have those patterns and customs and habits have roots back on your family tree that you are playing out every day and you don't even know about it. We always identified leitmotifs of repeated themes, like in a musical score, that you've inherited and you don't even know it. And once we open those vaults where your ancestors have been suspended, their names and their stories are never forgotten again. One of my happiest moments is handing our guests their full family tree with all of the ancestors that we've been able to find. And the more and more documents that get digitized, the more ancestors they'll be able to find if they pursue this research on their own or go to their local genealogical society or engage the services of a genealogist. It's kind of like talking about your favorite children.
Yeah.
I can't do that, but most recently we featured Clint Black and Roseanne Cash. Now, I grew up in the hills of West Virginia, halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., Piedmont, West Virginia, predominantly white town, 2,500 people, Irish, Italian paper mill town, a handful of black people, maybe 300 out of 2,500. And all you could get on the radio all day, it took up the whole bandwidth with WWVA because it was 50,000 watts up in Wheeling of country music. So you couldn't help but hear country music.
That's right.
And then Ray Charles, as it were, African-Americanized country music when he released I Can't Stop Loving You and made a whole album of country music.
Wow.
And when you think about it, the only difference between country music and the blues is a twang, is a sound, because the lyrics are the same. My baby left me and I'm gonna kill myself. You know, country music and the blues are all about love. Wanting love, trying to get love, having love, losing love, wanting to get love again.
That's right.
And they're the flip sides of the same coin. Well, it turns out that those roots, that relationship was a lot closer for Roseanne Cash. In 1965, her father, Johnny Cash, was arrested for possession of amphetamines. And there was a picture on the front page of a newspaper of him and his wife, who had Italian roots. And these racists accused her of being black. And for a year, they had to, you know, they were harassed by the Ku Klux Klan. And this is 1965, when interracial marriage was illegal in so many states, particularly in the former Confederacy. And Johnny Cash even had to release a statement, my wife is white. Well, guess what? Roseanne's fourth great grandmother was African, totally of African descent. She about fell off the chair. It turned out that though those articles were racist, they were absolutely right. She was a person of African descent. And so Roseanne's fourth great grandmother on her mother's side was Black, and her fourth great grandfather was white, the man who owned her, and who subsequently freed their children. And Clint Black, and she's 3.5% about African American. And Clint Black was 1%. And that means that Clint, back maybe, we couldn't identify the paper trail, but I loved Clint. Clint's my man. And I love Roseanne too. And Clint's fourth or fifth great grandparent on one of his lines was definitely a Black person. And Clint looked at me and said, well, I guess Clint Black is a little Black.
That's right, got a little soul.
I welcomed him to the hood.
Right. I tell you, my uncle, he loves finding your roots, and he also fought in the Vietnam War. My cousin, who actually doesn't live too far from here in North Houston, he's a senior in high school. I, for one, I love your work. My cousin loves your work. My uncle loves your work. And then I've got a little kid. I'll be a new father this upcoming fall. And
hey, congratulations.
I'm sure, you know what? He will be watching Finding Your Roots once that little baby comes into this world, Dr. Gates. So I just described to you 4 age groups. What is it about your brand of storytelling that tends to work well with the public of all ages, of all ethnicities, of all nationalities, journalist to journalist? You know, what makes so many people gravitate to you and your extraordinary work?
Well, that's a very kind thing for you to say. As a matter of fact, this is season 7 of Finding Your Roots, and we're having the highest ratings ever in our history, which is extraordinary for a series that is in its 7th season. And remember, I did 3 different series on genealogy and genetics before we changed the name to Finding Your Roots. Mm-hmm. When I started, I only did African Americans because that's my brand, right? I'm a professor of African and African American studies here at Harvard. Mm-hmm. And I did Oprah and Quincy and Chris Tucker and Bishop T.D. Jakes, my homeboy from West Virginia.
Sure.
Mae Jemison, the first Black female astronaut. Ben Carson, who was the classmate of Sheila and Elwyn Lee and I at Yale.
Wow. Wow.
And it was a big hit. And then we did a sequel. It was called African American Lives 2. And then a lady of Russian Jewish ancestry wrote and asked if I was a racist. How come we didn't do white people? It never had occurred to me because doing African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latin American, that's my brand, right? That's what I was trained to do.
Sure.
And so I talked to our executives at PBS and Paula Kerger, who at the time was at WNET, my dear, dear friend. And we all decided it was a good idea. We were going to expand the brand. So we did Meryl Streep and Stephen Colbert and Mike Nichols and Malcolm Gladwell, whose mother's Jamaican, and Elizabeth Alexander, whose grandfather was Jamaican, and several other people. And it just, we did Yo-Yo Ma and Christy Yamaguchi, and it just exploded. I think it's because, what's your favorite subject? Your favorite subject is yourself. And genealogy is a complex way of finding more and more about yourself. And I think that accounts for the huge popularity with these ancestry tracing companies using DNA, and we use 3 of those so that we can check and for accuracy for each of our guests. Ancestry.com is our lead sponsor. I have to say that, full disclosure. But we also use 23andMe and another company. And I think that those companies are so popular because it's a way of finding a hidden aspect about yourself. As far as how we produce our shows, We embed you and your ancestors in history, in historical events, and historical events that you encountered in textbooks in elementary school and middle school and high school, and you probably fell asleep or were bored through, or had an abstract relationship to. We embed those historical events in your own family tree. Imagine, look, I found out when they did my, as a surprise, on camera, they filmed my ancestry back in 2005 when I invented the series, African American Lives.
Sure.
My fourth great I descend from 3 sets of free African Americans. 6 people, 3 sets of fourth great grandparents. 2 on my mother's side, 1 on my father's side. 2 sets were freed by the American Revolution. The 3rd set were freed as a couple in 1823 in the will of a man who owned them named Abraham Van Meter. I have a copy of the will right upstairs. Wow. And he gave 1,000 acres of land. And there are 2 punchlines to this story. The first is, they lived 30 miles from where I was born and raised. Now, after roots, I'm looking for my roots in Africa. I'm looking that way, and all I had to do was look this way. They were right, my roots were right under my feet.
Wow.
And my family's been freed since the American Revolution. And the second astonishing surprise is that one of them, John Redmond, my fourth great grandfather, again on my mom's line, was a patriot. He fought in the Continental Army. I have his pension file upstairs. That's astonishing. I didn't even know when I was in high school there were any Black people who were part of the Continental Army. Imagine if I had known that in elementary school. Now, I was a good student. I love learning. So I memorized all the major battles of the American Revolution. There was even a family myth that we were descended from Horatio Gates, you know, the famous Revolutionary War general. We are not, nor are we related, unfortunately, to Bill Gates. But my own ancestor fought in the American Revolution, man. You could have knocked me over. Tears rolled down my face. And because of that, my brother, Dr. Paul Gates, very distinguished oral surgeon, if I say so myself, we were inducted into the Sons of the American Revolution. You can't make this stuff up. So everyone has surprises on their family tree. Sure. Not everyone cries, but many people cry. And it's very gratifying to me. We have, if not the most popular show on PBS, one of the 2 most popular shows on PBS. And that makes me very, very happy.
Dr. Gates, one quick question before we leave. Is there a story that you haven't told yet? What's next for you, Dr. Gates?
Oh, there's a story that we're going to tell. Jane Gates, my great-great-grandmother on my father's line, obviously the Gates line, was enslaved, unlike those other free ancestors I had. And she was free, and Jane Gates was freed in 1864 when Maryland abolished slavery. Maryland was a border state during the Civil War. She had 5 children. They were fathered by a white man, and she never revealed his identity. And C.C. Moore, our genius of a genetic genealogist, has used her method of triangulation, which was used to solve the Golden State serial killer case. Remember that a couple years ago?
I remember.
That was Cece's methodology.
Interesting.
She's used that same methodology, and she has found the identity of my great-great-grandfather. And we are going to have a family reunion soon as everybody's vaccinated and we can get on the other side of COVID. And we are going to reveal his identity. And every time I film back home, she's buried in the Gates plot in Cumberland, Maryland, which is right on the Maryland-West Virginia border, 25 miles from where my father and mother moved because the paper mill was there. And I go up to the family cemetery and I go to Jane's grave and I go, Grandma, I'm going to tell you a secret. I'm going to out you. And we're going to be able to do it. And there have been so much surmising going on for 150 years about who fathered Jane's children, and I know. And now everybody in my family will know, and I'll get a new family tree with all my Irish. We knew from my Y-DNA that he was of Irish descent. And now I'll have new ancestors, and I can rightfully celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And, you know, I don't know, maybe Ireland will smile on me and give me a passport, which would be great with me, because I love Ireland. I love Guinness.
You never know. Renowned historian and award-winning storyteller, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Thank you so much for having a flexible schedule, and thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
God bless you. I'm sending best wishes to everyone who suffered during that horrible weather. I love Houston. Thank you for your loyalty. I always check the Houston ratings, and they're always high, and I'm just sorry that I can't be with you in person. God bless.
Thank you. And with that, we're out of time. Once again, we thank Dr. Gates for his time today and for this inspiring documentary, The Black Church. This is our story. This is our song. A powerful story of a people and of an experience, universal and yet uniquely American. To find out more about Houston Public Media's Black History initiatives, visit our website, houstonpublicmedia.org/Black History. And remember, you can also join Dr. Gates on Finding Your Roots to witness incredible stories of today's personalities discovering the secrets that lie beneath their family tree. New episodes return this April, Tuesday nights on Houston Public Media TV 8. And you can always watch full episodes anytime at pbs.org. Once again, we'd like to thank Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and all of you for watching. On behalf of Houston Public Media and the University of Houston Racial Equity and Social Justice Committee, I'm Eddie Robinson. We leave you now with the soul-stirring sounds of Texas Southern University's Gospel Choir. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Good news. I'm available. Someone asked that question. Why do we sing in the Black church? Here's the reason why we sing. Make it personal. I sing because of I sing because of Jesus Christ made me free. Desire. Give me desire. Give me desire. No, he watches me.
This is our song. This is our story. These are our songs. This is our story, Lord. We bless the Lord.